Okay, I think it started. Okay, we'll start the video for like 2 seconds so people can see who we are. Oh, there you are. Okay. Hi guys. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm Claren. I'll step in the camera for 2 seconds. Hi guys, online. We are going to have Eric here from, I always say ASU Research Integrity, but you can clarify all that. We are going to do a brief overview. He is going to do a brief overview, just kind of general lay of the land, considerations for IRB for educational researchers. And then we will have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. And everybody who is online joining us, thank you. I'm going to mute everybody, but if you wouldn't mind typing your questions in, and I'll do my best to field those to Eric. I think one of his first slides, he says, you know, feel free to ask questions throughout. So you can do that, but depending on how the flow is going, I may wait until the end if it works, but I will make sure your questions are received. And then two, I think after today, if you guys think of additional questions as you're getting into your studies or something else comes up, like, oh shoot, I should have asked Eric that. Eric, are you okay with us filtering questions through to you?
Yeah, of course. Okay,
so we will do that. All right, we'll get started in just 1 more minute, and then what I might do before that though is just mute everybody.
Okay.
Eric, how do you spell your name?
ERIK.
Cool.
I can
Anyone happen to have an extra set of readers? I can see. Usually it's 7. You are welcome to come sit. You're welcome to come sit right here, Jennifer. Thank you. I might a little bit. All right, please now you understand why. Keep circulating. Did you guys get this? Okay. Did you get it? All right, Eric, whenever you're ready, and we'll probably have people both coming in here and online as you get going. So,
okay.
Are you good? I think it'll kind of go away as you start clicking on your slide. Maybe not.
Okay. Well, it's there.
Hang on.
I
think I can get rid of that.
Okay.
Hopefully not get rid of them. I thought. Here. Is that good enough? And I think that top bar will go up.
I think this will be okay. It's good enough.
Our cameras. We're just gonna go with that.
Okay. All right. So for starters, feel free to ask questions at any time.
I'm going to stop the camera on you.
Okay.
That's okay. Okay, there we go.
All right, so feel free to ask questions at any time. It's really great to have questions. IRB covers a broad range of research, so when I get your specific questions, that really helps me narrow down my presentation. So anytime, ask questions. I might just say we're going to cover that later, but still ask. All right, so I'm Eric Williams. This is a little bit of my background. Prior to coming to ASU, I was a board member at UW-Eau Claire. I have my CIP professional certification, blah, blah, blah. So overview and definitions. I work in the Office of Research Integrity and Assurance, and we do a lot of different stuff. We don't only do IRB. We do stuff for biosafety, stuff for IACUC, so animal care and use, stuff for security and export controls, that's sensitive information that we don't want falling into the hands of national enemies like China. Cultural reviews, responsible conduct and research, scientific diving, which I've never seen any study come through involving scientific diving, but we do it. And then human subjects research, which is the IRB. So the IRB reviews all proposed research involving human subjects to ensure that the subjects are treated ethically and fairly, and that the research is conducted in compliance with regulatory requirements. So I should preface this, I'm kind of breezing through this really quickly, so we have plenty of time for question and answer. I'm kind of assuming that you guys have a good background in this, is that correct? You kind of know what an IRB is?
You give by the focus summary. We've got a diverse group. We've got some research staff, students, and
Okay.
faculty here.
All right. So what is an IRB? An IRB technically refers to the actual board. At ASU, we have two boards. We have a bioscience board and a social behavioral board. And they meet to vote on the highest risk research procedures and protocols that are submitted for review. Reviews are conducted either by individual members from the board or by the full board. They get together, they meet, they discuss, and then they do a formal vote. Most of the research at ASU is not full board. I think we only had like 20, 30 studies a year that require full board review and approval. Boards have diverse membership requirements. They require a community member. At ASU, we have a prisoner rep on each board for prison research. You're required to have a scientist and non-scientist at every meeting. And it has to be a diverse representation of the types of research that is conducted at the university. So we have people from all over the university on the different boards. And we're overseen by OHRP, which is under the Department of Health and Human Services, sometimes the FDA, and sometimes other regulatory bodies. So what is human subjects research? This is the formal definition of human subjects research. It's really difficult to apply, particularly because of that research portion, which is a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. That's super tricky to apply because all of a sudden you're talking about, well, is this really generalizable? What does generalizability mean? What's the rubric? That can depend on disciplines. Some disciplines think a sample size of N1 is generalizable, and that's great research. Other disciplines will really disagree with that. So at ASU, we use a simpler rubric for determining if it's a research. And that's, are you planning on publishing or disseminating the results? And in the context of a course project, if the data will only be used within the course and won't be disseminated outside of that course, then we don't really consider it to be research. But dissemination includes buried honors theses, anything that's published like a dissertation, that can be kind of publication or dissemination. The second part, the human subjects part, so it has to meet both requirements. It has to involve human subjects and has to be research. So a human subject is a living individual about whom an investigator conducting research obtains data through intervention or interaction. That's really straightforward. If you're collecting blood, if you're asking them to complete surveys, those are kind of interventions or interactions. That second part, or identifiable private information. So even if you aren't interacting with a person, you could still be conducting research. And I imagine that a lot of you do this kind of work where you'll go into course grades to look at pre-post kind of evaluations of an educational technique or something. So that can be human subjects research. Even if you don't even know who the person is, it might be human subjects research. Does that make sense? Questions about that? Yeah.
If a faculty member was just doing it for their own improvement of their teaching, it would not be considered.
Yep, that doesn't really meet that. That's a perfect example. That doesn't really meet that research definition because they're not going to be generalizing the results. They're not going to be publishing or disseminating. Quality improvement projects are another example of that, where you might go in and try to improve a process, and you might have a survey about how good did this presentation go. If you're not publishing that data, it's not research. Yeah.
Is it Aaron?
Eric. Mm-hmm.
So you said disseminate and publish or?
Or.
It's an or.
Yep.
So if you're, let's just say that you're going to a conference and you're sharing some of those, you know, individual reflective, you know, teaching and higher ed practices, that's shareable, right? But you haven't gone through the IRB process for it, so therefore it's not really research. It would just be a share panel discussion or something.
Well,
yeah. Help me understand the distinction.
Can you try to also reiterate a little bit
the
question?
Yeah, so she was asking about sharing kind of anecdotal evidence at a conference. Again, that really points out how difficult it is to apply this definition. asking whether or not it's generalizable. I would look at this first part, the systematic investigation part. So is it a systematic approach to that data collection? Do you have a system in place for identifying these things you want to share, or are you just kind of talking with your coworker like, yeah, I had a student submit their paper late last week. So that is what we'd look at with your example. Is there a systematic way of collecting it? Does it make sense? Yeah. So yeah, the publication or dissemination isn't always a perfect rubric, but it works way better than getting into a long philosophical debate about epistemology and generalizable knowledge for every research study. So any other questions about that? All right, we can move on. So I want to briefly kind of skim over the history of human rights violations. I like to call them errors of enthusiasm. With the Nazis, it's kind of hard to call them errors of enthusiasm, but in a lot of other cases, it really is. Just researchers getting a little bit ahead of themselves, overlooking the rights and welfare of human subjects. So the history of human subjects research violations, the popular narrative is that it really kind of starts with the Nazis, the Nazi war crimes during World War II. Obviously, there were heinous stuff that was happening before them, but that's not really when the history starts, if that makes sense. These are a couple of examples of kind of events that happened. And then our first real ethical code of what ethical research looks like comes from the Nuremberg Code, which was the trial that they were convicting the Nazi scientists of war crimes during. They had to come up with this code in order to identify what ethical research looks like, to have a rubric to judge the scientists against. This code was only meant to apply to the Nuremberg trial. It wasn't kind of a broadly adopted code, and it still isn't. But I identified 10 key elements of what ethical research looks like. It's really biomedically oriented. For example, you have to perform animal experiments first. And it really kind of serves as our first kind of concrete rubric. After the Nuremberg Code, all this other stuff happened. Lots of stuff, lots of bad stuff. And I want to talk about Tuskegee, the Tuskegee syphilis study in particular, because I think this one is a really heinous and really interesting example for multiple reasons. So it went from 1932 to 1972. It was a DHS funded study. It wasn't called DHS back then, but it is now, which meant that it was approved by multiple directors of DHS. They signed off on it. During the study, hundreds of Black sharecroppers were told they were being treated for bad blood. The bad blood was syphilis, and they weren't being treated. They wanted to track how syphilis progressed if left untreated. So they were lying to the sharecroppers. No diagnosis were disclosed and no treatment was actually given. In 1947, penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis. They continued to withhold treatment after that. The study was terminated due to a leak in 1972. So nobody actually said like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. It was a leak to the press. And it directly led to the Belmont report and the development of IRBs in the United States. The first formal apology was in 1997 as well, which is interesting. And the study gets worse the more you delve into it. If you look at the specific histories, the preparations of it, it's really bad. So Tuskegee has lasting implications beyond just the impact on the participants. There's a general trend of mistrust of people in that area regarding research that's being conducted, regarding medication, going to the doctor, that kind of stuff. I was giving a presentation to the Cronkite School people, and somebody was actually a journalist in the area, and he says that even today, there's like broad mistrust of the research universities in the area, probably stemming from Tuskegee, at least in part. So after Tuskegee, we get two kind of overlapping regulations, the Belmont Report and the Common Rule. The Belmont report came out in 76, I think, right? 79. I think it's 76. Doesn't matter though. It really boils down the Nuremberg Code to these three key elements. That's respect for persons. That has to do with issues of consent, ensuring the participants consent willingly, they're not coerced, ensuring that they understand the research, and ensuring that they voluntarily participate given all those requirements. The second is beneficence. That has to do with having the interests of the participants in mind. Looking at how you can minimize the risk to the research while maximizing the benefit, and asking if there's another way that you can conduct the research that might result in lower harm, or preliminary studies that you can do to reduce harm. For example, testing on lab animals first in a biomedical context. And the third is justice, which has to do with the distribution of burdens and benefits on populations. So not just individuals, but on populations as a whole. And Tuskegee is a really good example of a research study that violates justice. They only conducted the experiment on those black sharecroppers, but presumably anybody with syphilis would have benefited. Any questions about that? So the Belmont report's really focused on kind of ethics, and then the common rule is really focused on regulations. So it describes how long IRBs can approve studies for, the required composition for boards to approve research, reporting requirements, all those kind of nitty-gritty regulatory requirements. And the federal codes are there if you're interested. It was first published in 1981 and then updated in 1991. And then again, we might be getting new regulations, though that's kind of been put off a couple times. And the rumors is that they might not go into effect. So that's interesting. But research misconduct after the regulations. So ASU is really famous in the IRB world. Whenever I introduce myself as being from ASU at conferences, they always bring up the Have a Secret Research Study. We're like the only university that's identified by name in IRB textbooks and stuff. It was bad. So in 1989, ASU conducted this research where we collected blood samples from members of the Have a Secret tribe. The blood samples were collected for a diabetes study. I think IRB approval was in place, everything looked good. Later, somebody came along and found the blood samples sitting in a freezer. They're like, oh, these are great. They'll be so awesome for my study on inbreeding, migration patterns, and schizophrenia. And that was never part of the original agreement, and that was never in place. The Have a Secret tribe found out and ended up suing ASU for a lot of money, and ended up winning, and it really damaged relationships between ASU and the tribe, and ASU and local tribes in general. That happened in 2004. And the Have a Secret tribe is really the first time that IRBs came to grapple with this concept of biospecimens, how biospecimens should be used, what kind of consent should be given. It's also an interesting example because it represents different cultural paradigms between our individualistic understanding of consent and maybe more communal understandings of consent in tribal areas. People, questions about that? These are also interesting examples that I like to touch upon because they represent a miscommunication between the different stakeholders and expectations regarding research. So in 2014, Facebook conducted this emotional cognition study where they were changing people's profiles and the content they saw to try to change their moods or attitudes. There was no consent involved. The people who were involved in it might not even know that they were involved in it. It could have been any one of us had we used Facebook during that period, actually. And people were really upset when this came out. They were surprised to see that their data was being used like this. They were surprised to see that there were test subjects without their consent. And the OkCupid data breach is similar as well. A researcher created this robot to scrape all the data from OkCupid. It wasn't necessarily easily accessible by the public. So he kind of took all this data, scraped it bit by bit, and compiled it in this huge data set. And then he published the entire data set, which included usernames, locations, sexual preferences, age, sometimes responses to open-ended questions, and people were pretty upset about that as well. The researcher argued, oh, it's all like publicly available, like it didn't even require IRB approval, he said, and that kind of caused an uproar. So I like to talk about those. They're interesting. They're kind of related in that they represent conflicts between the stakeholders. Researchers not fully understanding how participants expect their data to be used and how they expect to interact with the researchers. All right, any questions about the history? So review at ASU. So we kind of get a lot of questions regarding what exactly does the ASU IRB review and approve? Like, what are we really doing? So the ASU IRB approves any ASU affiliated students and faculty to conduct specific procedures using specific materials for research purposes. We're the umbrella that covers all of our students and faculty, regardless of who might be taking the lead on the research project. So if you're involved in a project that is being conducted at a University of Kentucky or something, you'll still need some kind of interaction with our IRB if you're a researcher in that project, because we're that umbrella for our students and faculty, and they're their umbrella for theirs. Also, that specific procedures using specific materials for research purposes. If you get IRB approval to conduct surveys, you don't necessarily have IRB approval to do follow-up interviews, unless if you're approved to do that. It's not really just a blanket thing that you say, we have our IRB in place, we're good. So it's that specific procedures and materials part. Any questions about that? All right. So when we're reviewing, we're essentially conducting a risk-benefit analysis. We're trying to minimize the risks, and oftentimes we can't really maximize the benefits, but by minimizing that risk, we're slanting that scale. A lot of research is minimal risk already, so the risk-benefit analysis doesn't make too much sense, but we still try to minimize the risk whenever possible. In those research projects that are already minimal risk, maybe don't require a lot of benefit to be present. So these are kind of our risk stratifications categories that we conduct reviews by. They're really poorly named. You've got exempt, expedited, and full board. People think exempt means it's like exempt from submitting, like I'm totally good. People think expedited means like faster, like a fast pass at Disneyland, where you gotta get bumped up in line. And then full board actually makes a lot of sense. But so exempt research is our lowest risk stratification of research. It includes almost all surveys of adults. If you're asking benign questions, it'll definitely fall under exempt research. Again, doesn't mean exempt from submitting or review or approval. It's exempt from certain requirements. So most exempt studies are approved in about a week. It really depends on turnaround time from the research team and how difficult the study is to just kind of review and the risk associated with it. So expedited is still minimal risk research, but it gets a little riskier. Expedited research can involve, for example, research on prisoners, low risk research on prisoners, research involving children, some biomedical procedures, survey questions that are about sensitive topics like drug use or conflict with the police or something, might be an expedited research protocol. Those take about 1 to 2 weeks because they're reviewed by the chair. And then greater than minimal risk is everything that doesn't fall under those categories. we're looking at really complicated research, in-depth research with prisoners, a lot of biomedical research, including like X-rays or radiation, that would fall under full board. And those can take month plus, sometimes 6 months if there's really a lot of issues with the protocol that need to be worked out. Only a full board can deny approval, so only the full board can disapprove your study. So if you get a disapproval, it kind of has to go down the entire chain. Any questions about risk stratification and review categories? Yeah.
When I've done scholarship of teaching and learning, I'm basically, in essence, conducting studies in the classes that I'm teaching, like other faculty in the department. And a lot of that research is pre-post or all institutions and semesters with identifiers. And a lot of the universities that send out with IRBs, exempt also always meant you had to have anonymous data. As soon as you put an identifier on it, it automatically became expedited. Is that the same here? It is.
That's not necessarily true. It really depends on the data. The exempt 2 criteria say that it has to be a de-identified and the data could put the participants at risk. We tend to kind of be a little bit more conservative. So even if the data is somewhat risky, we might bump it up. But oftentimes if you're just looking at grades or something, usually it can be exempt. Yeah.
Just to clarify, because I want to make, exempt doesn't mean that you don't have to do it. It means that you have to file it and you get an exempt.
Yep. It's a determination that the ASU IRB makes. So it's not like personal exempt from everything, like get out of jail free. Yeah.
And on that same note, maybe you're getting to it, but do you talk about consent? Like still need to get consent even if it's an exempt study?
Yep. Most exempt studies require some form of consent. A lot of exempt research, you're looking at like opt-in cover letters for the first page of your survey. Yeah, it really depends. Kind of coming up with answering a generic question like that's really tricky because in the IRB world, it almost always depends. Like, because research protocols, they get so complicated and no two are really alike. They're all different and they all have their unique challenges to overcome. Yeah.
Approval periods. Expedited, in my experiences, you would have to renew each year.
Yeah.
The IRB. The exempt one has been anywhere from, yes, you still have to redo it each year, 5 years, to nope, if it's exempt, you could do the research the rest of your life and you never have to submit it for exempt review.
Yeah, exemptions at ASU don't expire, so they're indefinite. Expedited research, there's usually a 1-year expiration date. That's changing with the new regulations that will allow us to waive the requirement for continuing review for expedited research. But again, that's very much in limbo right now, more in limbo than it was 3 months ago. So yeah, just look at your approval letter. It'll say your study expires on such and such date. So yeah, if you're confused, you can always refer to that approval letter, and the approval letter will kind of serve as your de facto thing. If you're complying with it, then you should be okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
If you want to do research on the classes you're teaching,
Yeah.
but you're not sure what courses they're going to be, but it's like a similar area of interest. Like let's say collecting data on students' opinions about the course experiences or something general.
Yeah.
Can you do an exempt study that's kind of like a blanket for any courses you're going to be teaching, or do you have to say, I have to fill out a study for every class every semester that I get a new course?
So we're looking at those specific procedures and specific materials. So if you can kind of write a protocol and you're kind of reusing the same survey questions for every class, then I see no reason why you couldn't do that. If your survey questions are varying for every single class, you can either submit those via a mod, but you need that approval. Modification. Yeah. Yeah, so it's that specific procedures thing. So if you can formulate specific procedures to do that, then we can approve that, and that's great. We see a lot of times researchers will kind of write themselves into holes where they'll say, oh, I'm going to conduct my research in August on this specific class. Then they're like, well, I want to do it in January again. But the protocol says August. So you got to submit a modification or you can't do it because those are specific procedures. So you can be open-ended. You can just say, I'm going to administer the survey in all the classes I'm teaching. The survey questions are attached.
But one more point too, though, you still would have to consent every semester, like, right?
Yep.
It would be part of the survey, like you were saying.
Yeah.
Like the consent language would be a part of the survey.
Can
Yeah,
you
that's
say
really
that in the
common.
microphone?
Yeah. So, so
I'm trying to type all the questions.
you would have to consent every time, because consent is, the participants are consenting for certain things.
Yeah.
They're not just consenting to whatever you want to do to them. So they would just be consenting to take that survey over the next 15 minutes. Makes sense.
I think I have a question line.
Okay.
Okay, so the question from Zoom is if it's not a survey that you're doing, you know, if we're talking about specific procedures,
yeah,
but it's just collecting the same class artifacts or like reflection data on the course shelf, would students need to consent to that?
Yeah, they would still need to consent to that. Again, it's not really like you have to consent every individual participant to agree to, for their consent to use that data for research purposes. So it's not really like you can consent like one group of students and then you're good forever. You have to consent them individually.
Do you know what that would look like though? Like, like I get it for a survey, but like if you're wanting to do,
it would be like you could do like a letter or something or some type of form at the beginning of the course saying, I'm using this course for research.
okay, all of your data.
Yeah, or this specific assignment would be collected. Do you consent to have your work? And then you, in that letter or whatever form it's taking, talk about if you're going to be identifying them or not, or those kind of things, right? And that could be a blanket thing that you use them with each course.
Yep. Yeah, that's entirely possible. Yeah, it would have to be explained in the protocol. But yeah, you could use the same consent letter every year. Usually for the release of course data, we require signed consent. Oftentimes we'll see it at the end of the course or maybe even after to eliminate kind of the possibility of coercion involved with the course. Yeah.
Okay. I'm just laughing because I'm trying to paraphrase and someone's like, we can hear the question. And I'm like quickly trying to do it. So, great. I told you now.
Oh, the mic works well apparently.
I've done research like that on Zoom actually, and basically now I don't want to give my data.
Or like opting out.
Yeah. That it's like, all right, I want to.
Yeah.
When you're pulling the data, you can't pull that student's work.
Yeah.
But sometimes professors forget about that. They're like, because again, especially at the beginning, and I think that everyone has done it, because I've had these conversations with the faculty. It's like, okay, so how are you going to keep track of the ones that say yeah? As well as I do the ones that say yes, but it's what are you going to put into processing so that way you're being ethical in your work.
Yeah, and to kind of paraphrase, you're talking about permissions to use the data. And I put this slide together real quickly for you. Just because you have access to data for a specific purpose doesn't mean you have access to use that for whatever you want. For example, I shouldn't use the copying machine to run my personal business in our office, but I can obviously use that copying machine to copy business documents. So you have to think about what hat you're wearing when. Are you wearing your researcher hat or are you wearing your instructor hat? You can probably access whatever data you want as an instructor to be able to grade the students, give them the final grade, but you don't necessarily have access to that as a researcher hat. I know that you were talking about opting out. At ASU, we don't really like opt-out procedures unless there's a really good justification for why it's needed. So usually we require consent to be in the affirmative, usually preferably signed consent. We can waive requirements, but they need to be justified. Does that make sense? Or-
I wasn't saying waiving that, it was
Yeah.
just. keeping
Yeah.
track of when students don't want to.
Yeah, but that's a question that pops up quite a bit, is just kind of, well, can I have my students opt out if they don't want their data used? That requires probably a pretty good justification.
In
Yeah.
terms of signed consent, can you talk a little bit more about what that looks like or how that's?
I mean, like, you collect their signature.
Yeah, but like,
Yeah.
does it have to be, like, if you're teaching online, like,
Yeah.
what does that
Mhm.
look like?
Yeah, you can collect signatures digitally. I think Qualtrics has like a little sign box thing. We've seen people just say like type your name and date, and that will serve as their signature. But we want some kind of active process where they are kind of inputting that signature, whether digital or handwritten. Either one will work. Yeah.
So for like say academic research now for our online students,
Mhm.
so a lot of times we wanted to see like when students they log into for Shell, like how many times they post like discussions. Do we need consent for those kind of data? Those are not like really student artifacts, but can we use that kind of data without getting students consent?
Yeah, it's still data, and you're still asking to use it for research purposes. So yeah, we'd expect some kind of consent procedure in there. There's kind of exceptions for if you're just looking at aggregate data. I have a slide someplace. It's kind of really slow to move. So we look at kind of aggregate data versus identifiable data and or individual level data. So if you're looking at that individual level data, we'd expect you to adhere to consent requirements unless we waive them. And if we waive them, again, you need that clear justification as to why. And usually that justification hinges on whether or not the research could practically be carried out if consent is required. If the research could not practically be carried out if consent is required. So usually that's the hard rubric to hit for that justification for a waiver.
And so that might come up, like if you wanted to compare maybe a course that you're teaching now to data from a previous course,
Mhm.
and you can't go back and find those students and say, can I
Yep.
Can I
Mhm.
look at participation in this discussion board from 2016 versus now?
Yeah.
So that's where you would get into this idea of.
Yeah, that would be a good justification for something that can practically be carried out. Saying, you know, I had these students 5 years ago, like I don't know any of them now. It would be impossible to recontact them. That could be a justification, yeah.
A justification for like exempt status or something? That's what
For a
or why you
waiver of
wouldn't
consent.
need consent,
Yep.
Why you
Mhm.
wouldn't need, okay, or why you wouldn't
Get it.
get
Yep.
consent.
For
Yep.
only that part of your population.
Yeah. Moving forward, like you would probably have two procedures. You would probably ask for a waiver of consent for that existing data where you could not possibly practically carry out the research without the waiver, and then obtain affirmative consent moving forward. We see that pretty commonly. That make sense? Yeah, so if you're just accessing aggregate data, IRB approval may not be required. You should probably send us a quick email though. Aggregate data really means that 94% of students logged in between 10 or 11 a.m. or something. The average course grade was 87%. Really that aggregate level. Once you start getting into individual level, like student A, grade A is X, grade B is Y, then that probably requires IRB approval. Any questions? Should we try to get back on the PowerPoint trail? See where we left off. Yeah, review times. I wanted to include our metrics quick so you get a feel for how quickly studies get turned around. I like to point to this chart, which makes us look really good in the IRB office. So that's average time that your average study spends with the IRB versus researchers. And you see that most studies are with the research team 83% of the time for exempt research. So that 12-day turnaround time, that's 83% spent with the research team. So if you're really quick about resubmitting, we can really turn out approvals very quickly. Oftentimes within hours if you're very quick to respond and the study's well done. But if you're kind of pokey, it can take months.
I can vouch, you guys are very, very fast.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
are too, I work.
Yeah, we're very fast, especially compared to peers. A lot of places, all exempt research takes at least 2 weeks for approval. And that's if the study's in good shape.
When should we submit?
Yeah, that doesn't mean slack.
It's
Wait,
called
wait.
So when do you need to submit? Is that what you were going to ask? All right. So any projects which meet that definition of human subject research, they have to be approved prior to any recruitment or data collection. So you can't go out and like recruit people and then say, oh, we're going to submit for approval later, it'll be fine. So prior to that recruitment or data collection. That doesn't necessarily mean data collected for non-research purposes. For example, if you're conducting your course and you got to collect assignments in order to give students grades, but you don't have IRB approval in place, you can say, well, sorry, guess you all get A's, guys. You can still collect that course grade, that course data, but you don't necessarily have permission to collect it for research purposes. Does that make sense? Was that a distinction I didn't need to spell out probably? I don't know. All right. So to go back to the definition of human subject research, is it research? Are you planning on disseminating or publishing the results of it? If you are, then you should probably just reach out to us. In your example of using the anecdotes where it might not be systematic, just send us a quick email and we can make that determination pretty easily and quickly. If you are planning to publish, then it probably is research or present at conferences, like a webinar or anything like that. So is it research? Does it involve human subjects? Interventions or interactions with humans for research purposes, or collection of identifiable private information, which can include coursework, medical records covered under HIPAA, that kind of stuff. Any other questions about this definition? So we leave the determination of if it's a research and human subjects research up to investigators, but if you're kind of on the fence, you should probably send us an email. That's pretty easy, just 2-3 lines describing your project, and we'll probably have follow-up questions, but it should be pretty painless. All right, so review at ASU. So this first slide determines who needs to be added as a study team member and who needs to complete study training. So that's anybody who is actively consenting participants. This has more of a biomedical meaning where you might sit down with somebody and talk about the consent form with them. So if you have somebody that's just like handing out your consent form, for example, you have a professor hand out your survey in class, and you just give them a stack of surveys, they send it out, and then get it back in and hand it right to you. They wouldn't be actively consenting to participants. That makes sense? Yeah. So anybody actively consenting, involved with data collection, having access to raw data, or analyzing the raw study data. They'd be considered a study team member to be engaged in research, and they have to complete study training. They have to be added to that study team member section and approved. Questions about that?
I'd just like to put one plug since the data strategy office often helps faculty with getting data on our students. One or more of our staff members would probably have to go into the IRB proposal, and that a lot of times get left off until they need data, and then it's this thing of, well, we really should have mentioned. And that's why our staff are looking at the city training, because we don't know which proposal we might be asked to put one in for.
Actually, that's not necessarily true.
I've done like a couple IRBs, that's why.
This is why this is why IRB presentations are so hard, because it depends. There are caveats for people who are just doing their job. The perfect example of that is like a phlebotomist, the person who collects like blood. You know, If you hire like a phlebotomist to collect your blood for your research project, they might not be engaged in research because they're only doing their job. So it's also kind of tied with professional recognition. So I guess you can ask the question, will I include their name on any papers that I publish?
If it contains identifiable data, then I'm assuming yes. If it's just
Yeah.
aggregated.
Not necessarily. If you're just collecting the data as part of your job.
You include extraction as data collection. Extract
Not
from
necessarily,
supervision
yeah.
system. Extract from systems that are doing the collecting of data as part of them. That's why.
Yeah,
it's-
it gets tricky. It really does.
I wouldn't want that to
Yeah.
prevent someone from like getting into IRB trouble when they're near the end of their project and then this comes back as a violation. And they didn't know to put that in.
Yeah, you can default to adding them. If they've completed city training, it doesn't hurt anything. You just have kind of more city team members than you need. And that's not a problem. We're not going to come back and say, well, were they really involved with data collection? You're better off with study team members. If you have a student who ends up never working on the project, that's fine if you add them to the study team member section.
What about faculty with your RAs? I would say if you have a research assistant working with you on the project, they should also be on their city training.
Yep. Anybody who's consenting participants, collecting data, analyzing the raw data, or even just has access to it.
Yeah.
And we're talking about the research data.
Yeah.
So it's that two hat thing.
Right.
If you're wearing your research hat and you're doing that stuff.
Well, probably a good
you
note
study team
from
member.
Patricia, just ask if you
Yeah.
said better safe than sorry if you're going to use student data that she's extracting or her office is extracting.
Yeah, you can always shoot us an email or give us a call during business hours. Some people try to call on weekends. I don't. I definitely don't work on weekends. If you have
Assignments due at 11:35.
Or ASU holidays, like Monday. that's
Yeah.
my birthday.
Yep.
Of course they're gonna be available.
not going to be answering phones on Monday. So at ASU, we require a faculty of full-time staff member to be the PI in projects. Students can't be PIs. So you might have students asking you to be your PI, be their PI. If you're a student, you've got to find a faculty or full-time staff member. We don't have any rubric of who you have to use, especially if you're just kind of finding a placeholder like faculty member, which you shouldn't do, but we see pretty often. So you can use your thesis director. It doesn't necessarily have to be your thesis director. It can be anybody who's willing to serve as the PI in your project and take responsibility for that project.
Does the faculty have
I think so. Maybe not. You'll see in the system has its rules built in, so they just won't be selectable as the PI if they're not. I think probably not, actually, because I know we have some non-full-time faculty PIs. Any questions about that?
I went through the IRB certification, maybe 9 years ago.
Mhm.
Full-time faculty always use graduate program. I didn't really do like research, although I'm action research and work about publishing it. When will I have to go through the IRB process again? Because I was told I inevitably have to go through my certification.
Yeah, that says right.
You're talking about city training?
Is that what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. So you have to have completed city training to be approved to conduct an IRB approved research study. So if you're not conducting research, not conducting human subject research, then you don't need to complete city training. But as soon as you do conduct human subject research, you need IRB approval, which requires you to have completed the course.
I remember this process. So I have to go through the process again.
Yep.
before I
Yeah. Yeah, you'll probably have to start from scratch too. It probably won't let you renew. So the city training is kind of this little online course thing with modules and then questions. It takes about 1 to 3 hours, probably more on the 3 hours mark than the 1. progress is saved between the modules. So you can take it on the bus to work, take the quiz, finish that, do the next one the next day, etc. And it's run by a third party. So we get kind of calls asking us to like run tech support for city. And we can't really do that. We can try to help as best we can. But it's not like an ASU thing. We pay city to use their resources. And training is good for 4 years. And then it expires and you've got to take a refresher course, which is a lot shorter and a lot easier. I think I can breeze over most of this. The important takeaway of this is to, one, not be too vague when you're writing your procedures, because then we won't know what you're doing. You can't just say, oh, like we might do some surveys and interviews, it'll be totally cool. They'll be fine. Like that's way too vague. Yeah, like they're totally cool. The students are cool with it. But you don't want to be too specific. You don't want to say, oh, we're going to recruit exactly 84 people. And from that, we're going to interview 67 or something. You can be flexible in your protocol and procedures. A good example is I'm going to interview my COM 365 students. And if you're just specifying those students only, then you're limited to that. But if you allow yourself to be open to other courses in the protocol and procedures, then you can write flexibility in. Any questions about that? Also, keep your protocol short and sweet. I see a lot of protocols that are just overwritten for really simple procedures, and that's a lot of time on your part probably, and it just kind of creates more complicated protocols for us to review. So if you're doing interviews, you can just say, we're conducting interviews, they're going to be 40 minutes long, questions are attached. As simple as that. This is what our protocol template looks like. Just a series of questions. I think you guys know what consent is. We can probably skip this. This is the one you guys are going to want to talk about.
But actually, can I ask one more question? Because I'm just thinking of those people who are interested in doing research of your class. So again, you said you don't typically like to opt out.
Yeah.
So if I'm teaching an online only class and I let them know that I'm going to be looking at the data as required by assignments to do my research, I guess I would love to just post that in the course shell and then say, if you don't want this, then contact me. But that's not what we would.
Yeah, we would not love that.
So you would rather have like maybe as an assignment, like I agree, like I type my name when I upload it to the.
Mhm.
Rather have that.
Yeah.
Assignment for 0 points.
Right. Yeah.
But the wording of that.
Oh, that will get. I know.
Very creative in the sense that like it can be part of an assignment that, you know, if you submit this, it's kind of implied that yes, you're going to participate in it, and it would be that format of you sign it, you submit it. If you don't want to be in it, then you don't sign it, but you submit it unsigned. Not participate. That's something like that where you have a yes, I'm doing this, or no, I'm not doing this.
Yeah, ideally just affirmative.
Yeah.
So like.
Do it, then you can't do that.
So what do you do with students that are adamant they don't want their data to be used?
And you don't use our data.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what if you're collecting data for points and it's more, not for the content, but for the fact that they did it, and they don't choose to do it, you offer an alternate assignment? So that they still have the same opportunity for the points.
So you're talking about like giving extra credit?
No, I'm talking about like straight up weekly reflections, get points for doing it, not necessarily for the content, because the content is data. But if you don't want to do it, you can use it.
But I think you just exclude the student who doesn't want you to do that reflection.
Yeah.
In your analysis, they still have to do it.
They do the work.
Oh,
You
yes.
just can't use that.
Yep.
So
Yes.
there's 30 students and 25 for your study. When you go to look at the data, you just don't look at those 5 students for it.
But then you'll also have to be really careful about the benefits versus the risks of participating in the study. So if you have assignments that are just for research and not for course content, that's going to be tricky to get approved.
Yeah.
Because you've got these predetermined group of people, right, that didn't want to be in the study, and you're saying, hey, I want you to do this extra work in this class so that I can research it. IRB is going to go, oh no.
So my understanding saying is that the assignment would be course related, but I'm looking at these 25 under this umbrella when I'm looking at the data.
Right, because I have 30 students, but 5 said, no, I don't want anything to do with this, but it's still coursework. So they're going to do the coursework, but you're not going to use
Required
those
for the
5.
course, and it's not, that
Right.
makes sense.
So that's why you have to be really careful when you're designing a study to ensure that if you are using your students, you're not going above and beyond whatever the content is for that course.
Mhm.
Then you've got that like tricky thing of you got to group people together and you're using them for some data instead.
So kind of what I'm thinking is like if I were to be working with teamwork in PLCs and 4 students don't want to be part of the study, they're just their own PLC. They're still doing the coursework in their PLC. I'm just not looking at how their group works.
Yeah.
For my collection.
Yeah, so
Okay, that makes sense.
the way that I would talk about that is that I would describe that you're asking permission to use data collected for non-research purposes for research purposes. So if they're doing all the PLC work as part of the regular class, and then you send them the consent forms and they don't respond in the affirmative that you can use that data, then you can't use that data. And you might still be collecting it under your instructor hat
Right.
as an instructor, but you can't repurpose it under your research hat to use for research purposes because you don't have permission to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about for, how about for students who are doing the teamwork and say like there are 4 students in a group, 2 of them consent, is participating, 2 of them don't consent.
Yeah.
Can we still use the 2 that they consent? But some of the work that are done by the 2 will be associated with the 2 that don't.
You guys are throwing me hard questions.
It seems like a
Yeah.
research design question too, like it's blurring over, it feels like IRB and the design of the study.
Yeah, and that's why you end up with what you have to.
That's hard. I mean,
Coding
it's
is like
hard.
missing data or basically user data that can't be used, so customers for functional data. Not that they didn't do the assignment, it's that they didn't give consent, so it's
Mhm.
functionally those data points aren't there.
I want
Yeah.
talking about like say when they are co-developing an artifact, right?
Mhm.
So part of the artifacts are done by the 2 that they don't consent. So we still use that artifact as
I would
our research data.
I would ask if you can separate them up. For example, if you have a collaborative project where like student A clearly contributed this portion and student B contributed this and they're clearly delineated, then I would say that you can just use student B's who consented and maybe not student A's who did not. If you can't really delineate it out and a member of the group says no, or it doesn't respond in the affirmative, then the answer is you probably can't use it. We see this, I see this as similar to video recording classes. A lot of times the researchers will video record teachers and they'll be focusing in on the teachers. And we ask the question, are you going to use any data from the students? And if the answer is no to that, then you don't necessarily have to consent the students because you're only focusing in on what the teacher's doing, what they're saying, maybe their body language, etc. Does that make sense?
I've got 2 questions from online.
Yeah. Mhm.
One just about the timeline of consent. Like if you wouldn't do the research until the end of the semester, can you consent them at the end after
Yeah.
grades have all been submitted, or
Yeah.
at the beginning?
If you're only pulling data for research purposes that had previously been collected, you can do it after the fact or at the
Okay.
beginning. Either one is fine.
But before you do the research.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then-
before that research portion starts, before you put on that researcher hat.
Okay, and then
Wait, before the activity is completed or before the analysis starts?
Before you put on the researcher hat.
Because
So-
you might do the activity as a teacher,
Yeah.
right, and then decide, oh, I want to use that now as a
Yeah, okay.
researcher. So then
Yeah.
before you can do the research work, you have to go back to consent.
Okay,
Mhm.
so it's interesting because it could depend on whether you're designing an assignment
Yeah.
with the intent of
Research.
right
Then it would need to be done earlier.
earlier. I agree. It's just there are shades of gray that I want to make sure we talk about.
Yeah, dual role issues are always really tricky because of that. Because it's really difficult to separate out what you're doing as a researcher and not a researcher. Especially with like teachers who are my wife's a teacher. So, you know, she's constantly developing new lesson plans, trying them out in the classroom. And that gets really tricky. And I would just really look at the different hats asking yourself when you're doing that human subjects research. So when you're pulling the data for research purposes, that's when you start to need IRB approval, and you need consent before you start doing that.
But to that point, then, if you're designing part of your study and you've already taught it and it doesn't get research approval, but you're expecting to be able to do, then that's tricky. So I would almost say it's probably better to do it early.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I mean, I bet designing like
If you
projects
are, not
for
too early.
research,
Yeah.
and then making your students do it probably violates some kind of ethical code someplace. Like that doesn't seem ethical. While it might not be like directly human subjects related.
I
Like,
mean,
yeah.
like, in going back to like scholarship of teaching and learning, if you have something that you want to make a change to what you're doing with your learning in your classroom, right? And you're going to put that into place either way.
Yeah,
Because you're
exactly.
improving your practice as an instructor or seeing what happens when I do this, right?
Mhm.
Then that's not necessarily we're playing around, I'm going to research this, but I would be doing this anyhow, but I want to publish it, I want to disseminate it. I know that from the get-go, I'm going to go for IRB.
Yep, that's exactly it.
Right?
Mhm.
One more, I think, relevant question to what Amish is asking. So if questions change slightly, like we want to try something a little bit different, or maybe this is actually, she said, interview questions or survey, would you have to resubmit your IRB if it has been determined exempt?
Yeah, if it's exempt, and if the questions are generally in line with what was improved, then the answer is usually no.
Okay.
Let me see if I have the language up in here. I'm not gonna mess with that. So, so exempt studies don't require modifications to be submitted unless if the changes would cause the study to no longer be exempt. And that's really weird and awkward because at ASU, the ASU IRB makes the exemption determination, and then we're asking you to continue to make that determination when changes are made. Generally, I like to tell people if you're just changing wording in materials, if you're just kind of adding survey questions that are in line with approved survey questions, then you wouldn't necessarily need to resubmit. You can resubmit just to be safe. With survey questions, usually it's a pretty easy process to kind of upload the new questions. But yeah, that gets kind of tricky. And if you have a question, you could just shoot us an email too.
Okay.
Do you have a question back there? Yeah.
You know what, actually, I was just thinking about it, just share it out. So it does seem like it would make sense to get that approval, that formal approval from the very start. Especially if we're looking, some of us are instructors in courses that are 7 weeks or so. So we do a lot more collaborative work with our students now on teams. And this is to the question that was posed by me. So maybe at the very beginning of the process, it might be a good idea to say, this is what I'm going to be doing. And then you get a sense of those that don't want to, put them on a team. And even if it's a smaller team, maybe as an instructor or professor, you work more closely with that team of 2, right? Because you're going to feel like it's not fair that you have teams of 4 working on products, and their product will be assessed with just 2 members associated because they chose not to be part of the study. So right from the get-go, it probably should be out there. This could potentially be all the district.
Yeah, that would be ideal. And that way the students know what they're submitting. They know that their content might be analyzed for research purposes. They might be a little bit more guarded in something, I don't know. They know what's going on and they have a good deal of what's happening.
So basically, we could get their content form before we put them.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And that's not enough.
Nope. Yep. That would be fine.
I think it's not ethical to get their consent before you put them into groups, but then if you base their grouping based on consent, I think that does raise ethical questions.
Yeah, it does.
So anytime you're I think,
Or research design questions, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Maybe because they, so I mean, it's very good, like, by collaboration, right? So if I'm this is an example, if I'm opting out of a study on collaboration, do all the people who are left believe more in collaboration? And so it led to question around the results of the study. It just is a really extreme.
Well, or even just generically, let's say this whole class is a study, but Meredith and I opted out. And so you're designing all these groups that rotate throughout the semester, but Meredith and I work together every single time because we opted out. Like just from a design standpoint.
Shouldn't have opted out.
Right, yeah. I mean, it's They put it up themselves when they.
Yeah.
I don't think you have sample language. I think that there was at the time, when you're doing research with your students that can help us craft language that says, you know, your participation will in no way influence the grade you receive in this class, and at any time, like I think when I did my last study, which was a number of years ago, but I think that we did tell them in their consent, like at any point you can opt out or opt in.
Yeah.
Right? So they decided, like, hey, if things weren't going well for them in the class, and they were like, I don't want to be a part of this.
Yeah.
But you're saying that opt-in language isn't, or opt-out language isn't something that you guys down with. So
Well,
what's the language, like, what's the student-friendly, like, accurate language to?
So, I mean, the language that you used was pretty good. And really, like, you guys can come up with plain word languages that will probably be pretty good. As for opting out, when I talk about opting out, it's different from withdrawing. Participants should always be able to withdraw at any time, unless if there's issues like clinical trials. Sometimes they can't because they might be taking a weird toxic substance or something that they have to get weaned off of. But barring that, they usually have to be able to withdraw from the study. So what you were describing kind of sounded a bit more like withdrawing from the research when they had previously.
And that's just part of the level. Like, if you at some point decide you want to withdraw, contact this person.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. Yeah. And I've even seen instructors say you can withdraw certain assignments from analysis if you just don't want them analyzed for research purposes. Just let me know, that kind of stuff. We don't have sample language though. So you could stop.
Sorry, you're still looking in my direction.
But if you submit it, it's not there, we'll probably provide some. All right, I'm ready for the next question.
Okay, well, it's not really a question, it's more, well, sorry. So in like the data analytics across like ASU now, a lot of the things that they're doing is all opt-in. So is that really, is that all sort of like IRB going more opt-in as well as the data analytics that we're doing across like the entire university more opting in? Is that because it's more of like an ASU push for opting in?
I don't know anything about that.
Okay.
I think a stat on it that, and Eric has mentioned this more subtly, when you are conducting research for your own improvement of teaching, that's not research.
Yep.
When you're in administration or a college or a department collecting data on your students, your faculty, staff, that's not research.
Yep.
So those analytics of ASU, those are for internal ASU purposes, not research purposes. So it does get grayer when you start to go, okay, I've got these data, performance data on my students. Now can you backfill what they did in their freshman year? Now you're tapping into institutional or college level data for research purposes. But now we're into research purposes. We need to see, or whoever is providing that freshman level data now has to probably has to be part of the IRB in terms of how are you using this? Were the students informed of other data were going to be extracted on them? Was that in your consent? Because again, that's where our office is. I probably push the ethics a bit further than other people that have been in my position. And it's just because of the different institutions I've been at and the embarrassment point and we're being sued that they've been more hyper aware. But it's one of those things that if it wasn't in your consent form, we won't release those data. Now, if you amend it and you can basically get what used to be called archival approval because the data are so old, the definition is so old, then we would see that revised form approved and then an office would release that freshman data. It would still be helpful for that unit to know, oh, I need these student IDs except for this one for like, I'm only going to provide the ones that provide. Here's our IRB, this is what you're approved to extract. And that's what a lot of times our office is starting to do is can we see your full IRBs? And that way we can move through and make sure that yes, it looks like you're getting covered before we release it. We're trying to also make sure we don't
violate.
Yep.
Is used in event like.
Yeah, so I have 2 points on that too. When you're accessing that kind of data, we want kind of a specific outline of what data you're going to be accessing. We'll see submissions where, oh, we're going to look at student grades. We want like a clear framework of what you're collecting. If you're collecting all student grades ever, that might be an okay framework to submit for, but we want to know that. If you're just looking at their grades in English 101, then just limit it to that. The second point is that data is usually also protected under FERPA, which touches base with research, but also extends well beyond research. So you can't necessarily share that data with people for even non-research purposes without consent or complying with one of the dozen of other ways data can be released via FERPA. Does that make sense? All right. Should we try to get back on track, or you guys want to freelance questions, or? Okay, writing the consent form, protocol document. Do I need a signature? We get this question a lot. Usually you don't need signatures if you're doing anonymous surveys or interviews of adults. If you're doing focus groups, if you're video recording, then you'll probably need a signature. You can submit for either way, and we'll just ask you to change it during the review process. That's usually not that hard or that much work. Any questions about signed consent requirements?
I just want to point out, if anyone has to go, I know this is it's one.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Feel free. We've got the room, so as long as you're okay.
Okay. Yeah, I'm fine.
We'll keep going. I know some people online had to connect off, but I want to make that note.
Yeah, I won't feel bad.
So for your students, right, especially graduate students, they're 18 or older,
Mhm.
and if we're just collecting the artifacts,
Yep.
don't need a signed consent.
No, you probably won't. Mhm. Really, we don't have signed consent for basically anonymous interviews and surveys. So if those are your only procedures, then you probably won't need signed consent. If you're doing anything beyond that, you probably will. Does that make sense? All right. This is kind of an overview of our process. When you submit, it'll go through a pre-review and then a designated review stage, which are 2 different people that review your submission, essentially. So you might even get conflicting information, and that makes people mad. But that's because 2 different people reviewed it, and they both just know it's different stuff. I'm going to point out this for people who are submitting. So I want to point out this little chart thing. If your submission is there, or there, it's back with the research team for edits. So we see a lot of studies that are sitting around, they're like, well, I submitted it, and they didn't actually submit it, they just uploaded new stuff and then let it sit. So you'll always just kind of want to double check that it's back with the IRB, either in the pre-review, IRB review, or post-review state.
For those online, was it the top row or the bottom row?
Yep, yeah.
Okay.
Unless pre-submission is with you guys, it's a bad chart because pre-submission should be on the bottom because then it's clearly delineated, but yeah, is what it is. All right, the heart thing, save button, use it liberally. ERA doesn't necessarily save changes, especially if you use that back button. If you use that back button, everything's lost if you didn't save.
Where do I find that?
Just when you log in to submit.
Yeah. So this is like, you create a new study and this is one of the first pages you see. Check mark continue button, that's how you move forward. There's a back button where the check mark would be on the opposite side. Upload materials using those buttons too. ERA is really a framework for kind of the Word documents that you'll be submitting. So there's not a lot of info in ERA. If you write up all those Word documents, you should the actual ERA part should be pretty easy. Modifications. All expedited and full board research requires modifications for anything. Exempt research, it's that rubric of will it change the review category. Are the changes in line with what was generally approved? Continuing reviews, exempt research doesn't expire, no continuing reviews needed. Some expedited research will still require annual continuing reviews, though you're going to start to see 5-year expiration dates. Giving extra credit, you guys want me to talk about this? Extra credit for participation?
Is that allowed?
Yeah. We always want to make sure that there's an alternative activity they can do where they can receive the same credit. So it's not like, because if you don't have an alternative activity, then it's kind of like you want an A in the class, you kind of have to do the research. The alternative should be equitable in terms of time and effort. A lot of times we'll see people read this one-page journal article or something. Any questions about that? All right. Secondary data, we talked about this. The different research hats, existing data. Tips for an easy review. Just keep things clear. Don't make us guess on stuff because we're not going to try and guess what you're doing. It needs to be clearly outlined. So we want to see how all the pieces fit together really easily and clearly. A lot of times studies get sent back just for consistency issues. The protocol will say the survey will take 10 minutes and then the consent form says it takes 30 minutes. So just kind of quickly looking over everything, making sure that everything aligns and that all the pieces are explained. And keep things simple. You don't have to delve a ton into the methodology of why you picked a particular instrument. What we're looking for, what are the questions? Like, what are the survey questions? So, does that make sense? All right.
I'm assuming further justification is warranted if it's controversial in terms of nature.
Yeah.
Like here's published article saying this is the technique that is often used to collect this.
It depends on risk. So if you're like using like a instrument that is controversial, but the questions are benign, usually it won't be any issue. Do you have like an example?
I was on a research project in which there was prior research that indicated you journal. So if you wrote about the most traumatic events in your life, it was therapeutic.
Yeah.
And so students were randomly assigned to, you just wrote about your day, you wrote about something mildly traumatic, and then the most traumatic in your life. And the IRB at that institution almost rejected it. And so the faculty member I was working with, as a grad student at the time, we had to basically show previous published studies saying that this technique, as well as when you do when you get upset, that this is how this is studied and there's the benefits of it. And so we had to put a lot more justification in because the members of the IRB committee at that time didn't know about the prior research, thought we were, making people relive the most horrible, horrific thing in their life. It's like, how is that research? And so that was an instance in which there was already established methodology and the research, the rationale, the theory behind what we were doing. But it took a lot longer to get approved than what was originally thought of.
Yeah, we've seen those occasionally. Usually those are expedited. Usually we require I can't think of the name, but like a sheet with resources that they can use or go to if they get depressed and want to kill themselves or something, which is probably unlikely.
So we can have extra staff on hand just in case someone would because people would come out of the study crying, but they also said they would be okay. But again, it was before we were collecting this data, had to do a lot more hurdles because it could be both the committee as well, not knowing that this is legitimate research and these are the standard techniques for that kind of study.
Yeah.
question related to collaboration. What if you are collaborating with somebody from another university?
Yeah, I think
And what if you are also collaborating with another university to conduct the study? There is a good chance that I'll be involved in a study where we have same group of participants, but one is at another university.
Yeah.
So how does the IRB work?
So it's about that umbrella thing, right? So each person has to have some kind of approval from their umbrella. So as an ASU investigator, you need some kind of approval from your ASU umbrella, right? You can do that in a number of ways. It can be both IRBs can review independently and issue their own approval. That might result in separate consent forms for each site that each site uses, and maybe even separate procedures. We might say that somebody's not engaged in research. If, for example, a lot of researchers come to ASU and they say, oh, I really want to send out a survey to your students. Do I need your IRB approval? And ASU in that situation might not be engaged in research if we're only forwarding on a link to our students of the survey. And the third option is to have one site defer review and approval to a different site. That's kind of a formal process. So we'll have one IRB defer review to another IRB, and that other IRB will serve as the IRB of record. That's a formal process between the two IRBs. Both IRB institutional officials sign that agreement, but that's possible too. So we asked that question first, are they affiliated with another IRB or ethics review committee? If they aren't, ASU will provide oversight for them, and we'll expect them to comply by our policies and procedures. If they are, you have to talk it about how the other IRB wants to handle it. If they want to defer review, if they want to be the IRB of record, where we would defer to them, or if they just want separate reviews. Or again, that non-engagement determination.
So from what you told me, I'm just recapping quickly. Both institutes can do their own IRBs and there will be two separate consent forms. So
Yep.
they can do it for their participants and we can do it for ours, and that would be probably the most easiest thing to do. As in, rather than deferring to another institute and go through the.
It really depends. IRBs don't talk well to each other. And some IRBs just won't defer review to others due to whatever reason. The UC school.
We faced that issue actually last year with complete friends.
So sometimes the separate submissions are simpler, but sometimes they aren't, especially with really complicated research studies with a lot of elements that might need to change in the future. In those cases, it's usually easier to defer review. If you're talking about a simple one-time survey, separate approvals might be simpler. But I would talk with the other IRB office. ASU is very willing to defer review or serve as the IRB of record. And we usually don't cause too many waves regarding that. So your hurdle will be what the other IRB wants to do and what they think is the easiest and smoothest. Yep. Any other questions? Have I talked too much already?
No, it's really helpful.
I have links to resources in this. Probably not super useful for the work you do, though the core network might be interesting. This is a good guide on how to link data using an anonymous reproducible ID. So if you need to link data across time, you can use this to not collect names. So for example, it might be the first 3 letters of your mother's name and then the last 3 digits of your phone number. So the data is still entirely anonymous. You couldn't really track that data back to an individual, but they're going to generate the same key each time. So you can link a pre-post survey, for example. That's really useful. And there's our contact information. You can reach out to us anytime. Just shoot us a quick email, give us a call. A lot of times we might just ask you to submit or ask for more information because the answer almost always depends. But that's a really good place to start.
I have one more question I forgot to ask
online group.
Yep.
So someone who teaches mostly online has had a handful of students share sites, which does artificial intelligence transcription. Is that, like, can you speak to like ethics and transcription with IRB?
Yeah, that would be fine. We kind of want to make sure that the data isn't like publicly available after transcribed. It probably isn't. They probably have reasonable security procedures in place for that. We'd also be looking at the risk of the data. What kind of questions you're asking. If you're asking questions about illegal drug use and you're definitely going to have their name, we're going to be way more picky on how you transcribe that data versus questions about your favorite ice cream flavor.
Okay.
So it depends on risk.
Okay.
So if you're higher risk, you might want to reach out to us.
Okay.
If you got low risk data, it'll probably be fine. You can submit. I haven't seen the digital transcription thing though.
Okay.
So that's new. Yeah. Okay.
Good luck.
All right. Any other questions?
The last question has been, but I'm sure it's the same question here. Would you mind sharing this recording or this? Well, I'm going to share the recording, but the PowerPoint slides.
Yeah.
As well as your
Yeah.
contact info.
I'll email that to you.
Yep.
Could you
And I'll
rem-
send out to
could you email me real quick to remind me because I'm
Yeah, oh,
super
yeah, I will,
forgetful.
I will. Yeah.
All right.
Great, thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Cool beans.
Thank you very much. I know a couple of you are hanging out here. I just want to make sure I properly stop this recording and don't lose the, don't touch the mouse. I don't want to lose it.
Sorry.
No, you're totally